The sound of the invoice hitting the kitchen counter was supposed to be a punchline, a punctuation mark on a frustrating, but ultimately manageable situation. Instead, it landed with a jarring thud, a stark white rectangle against the worn, familiar grain of the wood, screaming an absurdity that felt physical. $50 an hour. $50 an hour to fix something they had broken, something they had so cavalierly dismissed in our initial discussions as a minor oversight. My breath hitched in my throat, a tight, involuntary knot of disbelief tightening with a slow, creeping heat that had absolutely nothing to do with the midday sun peeking through the window blinds. It had all started so innocently, as these things so often do. A collaboration, a shared project that I was genuinely, unequivocally excited about. They were the established names, the ones with the gleaming, polished websites that spoke of success, the ones with the well-connected reputations that opened doors. I, on the other hand, was the newcomer, the hungry freelancer eager to prove myself, willing to pour in the extra hours, the late nights, the meticulous attention to detail that they seemed to value from a respectful distance. We'd meticulously agreed on terms, on the exact scope of work, on a realistic timeline. I'd poured my precious weekends into it, reshaped my entire personal schedule, all while diligently juggling my existing, ongoing commitments. Then, barely a week before the much-anticipated launch, an email arrived. Not a phone call, not a direct face-to-face conversation, but a sterile impersonal email that casually, almost glibly, informed me that the core functionality I had painstakingly built, the very engine that powered the entire project, was now rendered completely redundant. They had decided, at the 11th hour, to pivot to a completely different system. Their system. A system that they hadn't even so much as hinted at during our months of intensive planning and development. The explanation provided was frustratingly vague, a thinly veiled smokescreen of corporate buzzwords about synergy and evolving market trends. What it translated to, in practical, demoralizing terms for me, was months of dedicated work rendered not just obsolete but actively, painfully rewritten. They needed me to integrate their new system, which essentially meant dismantling everything I had meticulously built from the ground up, and then starting again, but this time on their terms, using their proprietary tools that I barely understood. When I, attempting to remain calm and professional, had pointed out that this constituted a significant departure from our original agreement, a complete and utter redefinition of the agreed-upon scope, the response I received was an almost dismissive shrug. "It's just a few tweaks," they'd said, their voices laced with an unwarranted confidence. "We're sure you can handle it quickly. We'll compensate you for your time, of course." The compensation arrived, as it turned out, 2 weeks later, well after the project had been successfully launched with their new system firmly in place. An invoice for their consultation during the integration process. My blood ran cold as my eyes scanned the numbers. It wasn't for my time, not for the countless hours I'd spent wrestling with their unfamiliar software, not for the gnawing stress of having to relearn everything I thought I knew about the project. It was a charge for their supposed expertise, their invaluable guidance, and the rate they had conjured out of thin air, with such brazen audacity, $50 an hour, for the distinct privilege of them watching me fix their colossal mess. The sheer, unadulterated gall of it all was almost breathtaking. I remembered sitting at my desk that evening, the invoice a stark, mocking testament to their unfettered entitlement. The initial shock, that icy wave of disbelief, had slowly given way to a quiet, simmering fury, a cold, hard resolve that settled deep within me. This wasn't truly about the money, not in the grand scheme of things. It was about respect. It was about the fundamental, deeply unfair imbalance they had so carelessly, so casually orchestrated. They had assumed, with a certainty that bordered on arrogance, that I would just buckle under their pressure, accept their narrative without question, and quietly absorb the cost and the indignity of it all. They had underestimated me, and in retrospect that was undeniably their first, and perhaps most significant, mistake. For days I said absolutely nothing. I let the invoice sit there on my desk, a constant, irksome reminder of their behavior. I replayed our conversations over and over in my mind, their smug certainty, their condescending tone, their utter lack of consideration. I didn't want to argue, to plead, to engage in a futile shouting match. That would only serve to validate their existing perception of me as someone they see. Old, easily push around, someone without backbone. I needed to find a way to address it, not with uncontrolled anger, but with an unassailable logic, a clear, irrefutable presentation of facts that would leave them no room for denial or evasion. I started the painstaking process of documenting everything. Every single email, every project update, every single agreement, no matter how minor. I pulled up the original proposal, the one they had so readily, so enthusiastically signed off on. I meticulously charted the timeline, the agreed-upon deliverables, the precise scope of the project. Then, with painstaking precision, I compared it to the reality of the project's final form and, most importantly, to the invoicing they had so boldly presented. The crucial piece, the single element that provided me with the leverage I desperately needed, was the initial project scope document. It was granular, painstakingly detailed, and it clearly outlined in unambiguous terms the exact functionality I had been hired to build. It also explicitly stated, in no uncertain terms, that any significant deviation from this defined scope would necessitate a formal change order, requiring mutual agreement and adjusted compensation. They hadn't issued a change order. They had simply dictated a change and then, with remarkable audacity, billed me for their help in implementing it. The turning point wasn't some dramatic, earth-shattering epiphany, but rather a quiet, dawning realization that settled upon me as I sat surrounded by my meticulously organized documentation. I didn't need to be loud. I didn't need to be confrontational. I just needed to be right. And the truth, when laid out with clarity and remarkable calm, could be an incredibly powerful force. I drafted a response. It wasn't an angry email, not in the slightest, but a concise, fact-based letter. I addressed it to both of them, the partners, the architects of this whole mess. I began by acknowledging, professionally and with genuine politeness, the successful launch of the project. Then, I gently but firmly referenced our original agreement and the project scope document that was its cornerstone. I politely but with an unwavering firmness, highlighted the unilateral change in direction they had imposed and, critically, the absence of a formal change order, as clearly stipulated in our initial contract. I then presented, without fanfare, my own invoice. My invoice was for the time I had actually spent integrating their unsolicited system. It was a reasonable rate, a figure we had discussed in passing for potential future work, but never formally agreed upon for this specific project. Crucially, it didn't include any charges for their supposed consultation. Instead, it included a specific line item for administrative and project management time, scope deviation. This carefully accounted for the hours I'd spent documenting their changes, analyzing the impact of their decisions, and preparing my meticulously crafted response. The total was significantly less than what they had billed me for, but it accurately reflected the reality of the situation from my perspective. I attached copies of all relevant documents, the original proposal, the signed scope document, and the email where they had so casually announced the change. I made a conscious effort to keep the tone professional, bordering on neutral. There was no hint of accusation, no emotional language whatsoever. Just the facts presented clearly and logically. I concluded the letter by stating, with polite finality, that this was my final invoice for the project and that I looked forward to moving forward on future endeavors with clear, mutually agreed upon scopes. The silence that followed after I sent that email was profound, almost deafening. For days, nothing. I went about my regular work, a strange, uncharacteristic sense of calm settling over me. I had done what I could. I had presented my case clearly and logically, and now it was entirely up to them to respond. Then the phone call came. It was the senior partner, his voice tight, strained, a clear indication of his displeasure. He started by asking, rather abruptly, if I had received his previous invoice. I confirmed that I had. He then launched into a rather heated tirade about how my invoice was utterly unacceptable, that I was clearly trying to overcharge them, that their time was, of course, incredibly valuable. He kept circling back to the $50 an hour they had billed me, as if it were some immutable, untouchable law of nature. I listened patiently, letting him vent his frustrations without interruption. When he finally paused, taking a shallow breath, I calmly reiterated my points. I gently reminded him of the contract, of the original scope, of the glaring absence of a change order. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt his flow. I just stated the facts again, each word precise and deliberately chosen. I explained in simple terms, that my invoice reflected the actual work I had done to accommodate their unsolicited change, and that their charge was for services I had not requested and which were not part of our original agreement. I also mentioned, as a gentle reminder, that I had attached all the necessary documentation for their review, including the original scope which they had themselves signed. There was a long, pregnant pause on the other end of the line. The air crackled with unspoken tension and a palpable sense of something shifting. Then his tone shifted, subtly but noticeably. It wasn't an apology, not by a long shot, but it was a definite concession. He mumbled something about miscommunication, about how they had assumed I understood the necessity of the change. He then said in a decidedly grudging tone that they would review my invoice. A week later, I received a notification of payment. It was for the exact amount of my invoice. No explanation was offered, no further communication ensued. Just the payment appearing in my account as if by magic. The social consequence, while not dramatic, was undeniably subtle, yet palpable. At industry networking events, I noticed a distinct, observable shift in their demeanor whenever I was present. The overly friendly, almost effusive greetings that had once been their standard practice became more reserved. The eye contact became more fleeting, almost avoiding mine. They no longer sought me out for casual conversations. It was as if a small, inconvenient truth had been subtly exposed, and they weren't entirely comfortable with its implications. Their carefully cultivated reputation for being both innovative and fair had, in my small corner of their professional world, been subtly tarnished not by scandal, but by a quiet exposure of their sharp, perhaps unethical, practices. They had tried to extract $50 an hour for a mistake they themselves had made, and instead they had paid for my time, acknowledging in their own inscrutable way that their sense of entitlement indeed had a price. And for me, that quiet resolution, that simple, powerful act of standing my ground with facts and an unwavering restraint, felt like justice enough.